It's time to kick things off. Can you hear me? I think we're unmuted. Good. Welcome everyone to tonight's Zoom call. This evening we're going to talk a little bit about the emergency measures that are being introduced by governments across Europe as a result of the coronavirus crisis. We want to ask the question, how can the left strike a balance between recognising the need for restricted movement, maintaining civil liberties and defending our democratic rights? We currently have about 300 people on the call and more watching on Facebook, which is amazing. We've got people from all over the world joining us. So thanks again for taking the time to be here. My name's Emma and I work for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, who have partnered with the World Transformed and Momentum to bring you this week's call. RLS is a political foundation connected to the German left party Die Linke. We work to build left power and social movements around the world by delivering and supporting political education initiatives. I'm also a long-standing TWT volunteer, a member of Unite, the London Renters Union, and I help out with the campaign for a 4-day week.
Hiya, I'm Paddy. I've been campaigning on the left for a few years now and a Momentum volunteer. I'm also a member of Unite, of the 4-day week campaign, and I'm a PhD researcher. So TWT have been organising these weekly calls since the crisis began, and this is now our 7th call. So far, the calls have focused primarily on the government's lack of action, failure to provide sufficient PPE for key workers, the gaps in economic support, meaning that some people are still forced to choose between staying safe and paying the bills, and the fact that across Europe, a decade of underfunding has reduced the ability of countries to respond effectively in the first place.
This week, we want to look at the dangers that stem from the actions the government has taken. While some measures of physical distancing are essential in order to slow the spread of infection and relieve pressure on care workers and hospitals, governments across Europe have introduced legislation which severely cuts back on the rights of civil society. Interventions such as the shutdown of borders and educational institutions, enhanced police powers, and the prohibition of demonstrations and free movement are repressive, often anti-democratic, and represent significant infringements on our civil liberties. Should we be concerned that governments are exploiting this pandemic to further their political agenda?
These concerns, and indeed this crisis, are by no means confined to the UK. As of today, there are over 3 million confirmed cases of coronavirus worldwide, and tragically over 200,000 deaths. And over half of these deaths have been in Europe. While almost all of Europe has seen restrictions imposed on normal life, there are still big variations in the conditions and the effects of the lockdown between countries. In some cases, authoritarian governments have explicitly used this crisis as an excuse to consolidate power. The most extreme example of this is in Hungary, where at the end of March, Viktor Orban gave himself powers that would make him a quasi-dictator, with the power to jail anyone deemed to be spreading misinformation. We wanted to invite a speaker from Hungary to this call, but found that people were reluctant to speak up about the situation for fear of being persecuted. Left-wing authors are publishing anonymously on the situation, but it is anonymously because they fear persecution and prosecution. But we are very pleased to be joined by speakers from 5 other European countries. They will help us understand more about how the pandemic has affected people in different political circumstances. They'll provide an insight into how their own governments have responded and what threat this poses to civil liberties and democracy in their country.
The UK was slower than a lot of countries in Europe to issue a lockdown, and the conditions of lockdown that we're seeing here are still less severe than in other European states. Unlike some of our European neighbours, most public spaces remain open and we do not require documentation simply to leave the house. While one might think of the UK government as relatively liberal in comparison to more explicitly authoritarian states, it's really important to remember that the boundaries between mainstream conservatism and right-wing populism and extremism have been blurring for some time now, both in Parliament and in the mainstream press. We know, for example, that Johnson already supports racist stop and search policing policies, and we've seen examples of the police on the news and on social media using their new powers overzealously and inconsistently. We also know that it's people of colour who will bear the brunt of this. The endless Brexit confrontation has already proved that the current leadership are more than willing to seize a political crisis and use it to further their own agenda. In suspending Parliament in September last year, Johnson showed a total disregard for democratic process, and we know that this government is keen to push through policy which will suppress votership among marginalised communities.
But as Tory MPs and businesses call for an end to the lockdown, and even the Labour leadership directs most of its effort towards demanding an exit strategy, the left finds itself in the unusual position of having to call for the continued restriction of people's freedom. We need to be critical of the nature, scope, and time span of the measures being introduced, but at the same time, we cannot support calls for ending physical distancing before it's safe to do so. Tonight, we'll be asking how the left can reconcile this tension between public health and civil liberties. How do we both demand that the governments act to protect people, while at the same time ensuring the crisis is not used as a reason to bypass the usual checks and balances on government power?
To help us think through some of these issues, we have an amazing range of speakers from across Europe. First up, calling from Athens, we have Panagiotis Sotiris, a journalist, academic, and long-time activist in the Greek anti-capitalist left. Panagiotis will talk to us about some of the theory behind the state of exception, drawing on examples of government interventions in Greece. Next, we'll be joined by Filip Balunovic, an academic and activist from Serbia, and he'll talk to us a little bit about what the response to this pandemic has looked like in a country that's already taken an authoritarian turn.
Then we have Malena Reali, an editor of the French left-wing media outlet Vent Se Lève, who will talk to us about some of the differences between the lockdown in France and in the UK, and how France has a very recent precedent of the state maintaining emergency powers far beyond the emergency itself. From Poland, we'll be joined by Marcin Antosiewicz, a journalist and political scientist. Marcin is going to discuss how the government there is exploiting this current situation and the resulting bump in polls to force through an early election at a time when it is all but impossible for the opposition to campaign. Finally, we will hear from Gracie May Bradley, Policy and Campaigns Manager for Liberty here in the UK. Gracie will give us some more details on the extent of the coronavirus bill that was passed here, and how it is affecting people and how the left should respond to it.
We should be done with the call in around 75 to 90 minutes. And just to say that if you have any questions during the call, please do post them in the chat box and we'll do our best to put these questions to the speakers. Where it isn't possible, we'll try and incorporate these questions into follow-up actions or to future discussions. There are a lot of people on the call, which is amazing. We're well over 300 people now, but it does mean that we need to use the chat in a responsible way so that it can be a useful tool throughout the call. So please bear that in mind when you're posting. Also, just to say, we are doing this from home, and even at this point during the lockdown, we haven't quite mastered Zoom. So please bear with us if there are any technical glitches along the way. We'll try and resolve them as quickly as possible. I just want to say finally a huge thanks to all of our speakers again for giving up their time to join us tonight, and especially for agreeing to speak to us in English. It's really important that our movement is internationalist and that we learn from each other's struggles where we can.
So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to journalist and academic Panagiotis Sotiris in Athens. Panagiotis, thanks for joining us tonight. Could you talk to us a bit about the theory of the state of exception and why we might be concerned about the long-term effects of some of the powers being introduced across Europe?
Okay, first of all, many thanks for this invitation and the opportunity for this discussion. I mean, the question that we're facing is in a way both simple and very complex. On the one hand, we have to admit that we have a public health state of emergency. The pandemic is real. It is a result of processes to a certain extent that a result of processes of globalized capitalism. Its impact has to do with the tragic effects of neoliberal policies upon health systems and also upon the general health situation of the population and the total lack of epidemiological preparedness. But there is the open question whether this public health emergency should necessarily lead to a state of exception. The state of exception is a notion coming from the political philosophy, and it became particularly politically and theoretically pertinent during the war on terror, that period, and the extreme erosion of civil liberties associated with it, and later with the inhuman treatment of refugees and asylum seekers in various parts of the world. And it points exactly to that kind of suspension of basic democratic and civil liberties in the name of an extreme emergency. Now, forced lockdowns in most countries have been met with increased approval. I mean, even in Greece, generally they have been respected, and they have seemed to a certain extent to work in terms of limiting the impact of the pandemic. And Greece relatively has had a very low level of both disease and victims. But at the same time, it's important to know, if we look at the international experience, that to a certain extent, those lockdown measures had the tragic blind spots, which had actually to do with the lack of preparedness for the pandemic. We've seen the tragedy with mass deaths in nursing homes and care facilities in various countries. We've seen the problems of overflooded hospitals turning into points of transmission. We have seen also the effects of social determinants of health and poverty in cases such as increased mortality in poor Black and Hispanic persons under 65 in New York. And one might say that there was even a certain hypocrisy when there were discussions in various countries, including Greece, about, for example, what to do with people jogging in parks, whereas at the same time no measures were taken for nursing homes or care facilities. But still, there is a question that there are very important, one might say, side effects in regards of this imposition of blanket kind of lockdowns. And especially in consideration of the right of protest. For example, in Greece, the Greek government has taken advantage of this situation of the lockdown to pass through parliament. It is happening in these days, actually, two very important pieces of legislation. One which had to do with a neoliberal reform of education, another which had to do with environmental protection, actually curtailing environmental protection. In a way, taking advantage of the inability to stage mass protests. And there's also a very justified fear that governments may continue to use this extreme measure in a period of even some kind of lift of restrictions, because we are facing a very big economic depression, and it's obvious that what is at stake is who is going to bear the cost of it, and governments are going to put it on the shoulders of working classes all over the world. And using a situation of state of exception in a certain way can offer a justification to attack the fully justified right to protest. On the other hand, we cannot ally ourselves with neoliberals or libertarians calling for a totally irresponsible negation of any physical distancing measures, or alt-right, or of course with those cynical segments of the business class that call for an immediate return to normality in the sense of with no consideration for the high risk of infection. But I think that there is a way to think of both public health and politics in general beyond the state of exception, even in such a. And I think that it is worth to go back to the notion of biopolitics coming from. Although traditionally this notion has been used to describe the expansion of state coercion and surveillance associated with public health measures and other interventions to populations, I think that it is possible to think a potentially democratic biopolitics, or biopolitics from below. Because in such a perspective, the decisions, for example, from the reduction of movements, or for physical distancing, or for avoiding collective or individual practices that put other people at risk, would be the result of democratically discussed decisions based on knowledge available and disseminated to the population, and as part not of compliance, but of a collective responsibility to others, and as a practice of solidarity, which, by the way, is the only way to move beyond the individualized fear that has been part of our contemporary, let's say, environment, towards the idea of collective effort, collective solidarity, and also collective struggle, which in certain cases, such as a pandemic, can be even more important than medical interventions. And I think that we have resources to look to that direction. There are things that we can look to the history of popular movements and social movements. For example, one might look at that old strategy of the Black Panthers in the US, survival pending revolution, which actually had to do with building clinics in the inner cities or waging campaigns for public health. One might think the struggle against HIV and AIDS, where the actions of movements such as ACT UP was very crucial to lift off the stigma and also to change the very perception of the disease. For example, to move from groups in danger towards the need for safer practices. All these to do movements intervening. We can point even to how the latest Ebola pandemic was treated, and Paul Richards, the anthropologist, has written a very, very important book on this subject, suggesting that the crucial step was that communities started to think as epidemiologists, so organizing more collective efforts. And I think that this means that if we think into that direction of biopolitics from below, contemporary movements have a lot of space to do. They can ask for, of course, for more support to public health systems and more preparedness for a prolonged fight with the pandemic. They can ask for measures, restrictions that are much more suited to the lives of the communities, that take account of blind spots, that take account of the fact, for example, that many people cannot stay home, are much more exposed and affected by the disease. They can point to forms of solidarity and self-organization. We have, even in Greece, in Athens, various networks in neighborhoods caring for people who are forced to stay at home, but they cannot cater from themselves, so they need food or they need the basic errands being done. And of course, we can ask that if there's going to be a question of state coercion, this should be mainly used to channel resources from the private sphere to the public sphere. For example, using private health sector facilities as part or the health industry facilities as part of the effort to fight the pandemic. And I think there are many ways where we can use and put our collective ingenuity in good practice to deal with the pandemic and offer a possibility of a different, non-coercive, democratic, one might say, biopolitics. And of course, this is the only way to also, that's been my final point, the other big challenge, which is how we organize ourselves against the cost of the pandemic, the cost not only in human life, the tremendous social cost associated with the depression, which is at the same time a very grave danger for the working classes all over Europe and all over the world. But at the same time, it is a manifestation of a profound crisis of neoliberal governments, which means that for the left, for popular movements, for radical social movements, there's ample space to offer an alternative to a society that realizes that we are at a turning point and that we are at a point where we need to make very big and important decisions, what it actually means to lead a human life on this planet. And of course, there's also a lesson for that, probably climate catastrophe, climate change, the other ongoing real-time disaster.
Great, thanks so much, Panagiotis. That was really, really helpful. There's certainly a lot to think about there, and that really provides some useful context for some of our listeners as we hear from other speakers on the call tonight. We have had some questions from people listening, and it's really interesting to hear you talk about sort of collective responses to the virus versus sort of top-down approaches. And you mentioned the term biopolitics a couple of times. Just for people who maybe aren't familiar with that term, would you be able to talk a little bit more about what you mean by biopolitics?
Well, biopolitics is a term used by Michel Foucault in his works, and initially he used it to describe how around 18th century, 18th century and 19th century, governments started to take an interest in the health of population, in the sense of how they could be really productive. And this led to public health measures from quarantines to vaccination and things, and all things that we are now associated with, which at the same time, it was a form of exercise of power, which was at the same time, one might say, coercive, also try to deal with problems. And although usually we use these terms in social sciences to describe this expansion of power associated with public health measures, and also in order to articulate a critique of them, I'm suggesting that we might see it a more, let's say, more openly, kind of biopolitics from below, or democratic biopolitics, where we collectively decide on how we want to deal with things like, such as our livelihoods and our health, and based on the action of social movements. That's the basic point I'm trying to make.
Amazing, thank you. You broke up a little bit there, but I think we got most of that. And actually, for anyone that's listening, Panagiotis wrote an article as the crisis was beginning, which really touches on lots of the issues that he's covered there. So if you're interested in thinking through some of that a little bit more, including this idea of biopolitics, then we'll post a link to that article in the chat. But yeah, that was fantastic. Thanks so much for taking the time, Panagiotis. Actually, we do have one more question before you go. And this is something, yeah, obviously very close to home. So there's a lot of interest here in how Greece is dealing with the migration situation in combination with coronavirus crisis. For example, do migrants have access to proper healthcare at the moment?
Well, this is one of our biggest actually struggles here about social movements, bringing forward the question of the situation in camps. Camps in Greece, refugee camps, are overcrowded, and the situation in terms of health standards is not very good, especially in the island of Lesbos, in the infamous Moria camp. It's very difficult, for example, to practice things like washing your hands 10 times a day, etc., etc. So there's a very strong pressure from the part of social movements to reduce the population of camps and make sure that the health conditions are improved there. Alternative forms of their hospitality are offered, and also to avoid any kind of stigmatization, because especially the Greek right and the Greek far right always have already had created a narrative of refugee camps being points of transmission from the disease. In reality, of course, this has no relation to the truth. Actually, all cases of refugees being infected had to do with infections coming from the outside, that is from the Greek population. And so far, we had some result in the sense that the Greek government has tried to at least present an image of a more humane treatment of this subject and avoid very openly aggressive racist rhetoric, or which it was its initial tone.
Oh, we just lost him at the end there, I think. But that was, okay. Yeah, that was a really excellent sort of introduction to the way that the Greek government is dealing with what was already a really pressing crisis, and the kind of really enhanced dangers that lots of people in those camps are facing as a result of the virus. Yeah, Panagiotis, if you can still hear us, thank you very much. That was great. And there is a link to the article in the chat for anyone that's interested in reading more. Next up, we have a speaker from Serbia. Filip Balunovic is an academic who just submitted his PhD thesis in Florence. He's also an executive editor at the Serbian edition of Le Monde Diplomatique, and an activist trying to build a left political movement in Serbia. Filip, thanks so much for joining us. With no viable left opposition to speak of, the political situation in Serbia is obviously very different to that of the UK. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the political situation and tell us how this crisis is playing out in a country where the government has already taken a considerably more, or already has considerably more executive power?
Thank you very much for the invitation. When you said that you tried to reach a speaker from Hungary, I think I'll be good cover up because the situation when it comes to authoritarian rule is quite not the same, but it's we're heading there. So it's quite tricky to talk from the perspective of a country which has passed the way from the authoritarian tendencies to today we can clearly speak of authoritarian condition. And under such circumstances, you usually have this polarized society, either you are against or you are in favor. But there are different types of authoritarian rules. Some authoritarian rules even are actually supported by majority of inhabitants. And Serbia is not one of those cases, because the authoritarian ruler, the President Vučić, who came to power 7-8 years ago, is actually ruling in a rather strange way. He is actually a former extreme right winger, whose role in the wars of 1990s was extremely important for the Serbian propaganda machinery. And now, meanwhile, he has become a modest conservative or a modest European. And he's actually ruling by fear. He's ruling by blackmailing people, and trust in him is actually quite low. Why, in spite of the fact that he won the presidential elections in the first round, for instance, 3 years ago, winning over 50% of votes in the first round. But why is this important for the time of pandemic? It is important because the lack of trust in the institutions, in the political system as such, is actually spilling over to the lack of trust also for the medical experts who are talking on behalf of medical profession, but are somehow shadowed by the political elite. So we are finding ourselves in a rather strange situation when you don't know whether medical experts who are telling you should stay at home, for instance, for the next 4 days, there is a total lockdown, or you should socially distance yourself from the other one, virus is dangerous, and so on. You don't know whether to trust those people, because you don't know whether a decision that is taken, a medical decision, is taken in the political circles or in the medical circles. This is the overall atmosphere that is kind of hunting this country. Talking about the conditions, it is important to emphasize that the government, including the medical experts, including the president, were laughing at the virus at the beginning, saying that the virus is ridiculous, that this is nothing more than a flu. And then overnight, they changed the perspective when the things started happening in Italy, which is closer to home. They shifted the story, started talking that we should all stick to the rules that are coming from the medical experts and so on. The fact that the authoritarian ruler in this country is a former extreme right winger is important, because the political culture of the country is constantly is built up in a way that you are constantly trying to find the big other. So you are constantly trying to find an enemy. So under conditions of pandemic, this enemy is virus, but they weren't satisfied with it. So they had to find. So 30 years ago, when he was becoming politically active, the enemies were Croats, Albanians, Bosnian Muslims, and so on. Now, the enemy in the first couple of weeks were people who have Serbian citizenship and who live abroad and who decided to come to Serbia. So for a couple of weeks, there were frontal attacks on people coming from Italy, from Germany, from all around the world, who are actually bringing the virus to Serbia. And this kind of strategy is actually polarizing society. Half of it is still trustworthy in medical workers, but they don't trust the government at all. The other half is actually trying to balance between the common sense, so we should really be responsible, and kind of rejection to do and whatever the government says. The people want to do the opposite, and this is why you don't have a trustworthy institutions, you don't have a trustworthy government, and this is why the government had to impose measures that are among the harshest measures in Europe. We can only compare to Italy and Spain, where the number of deaths in the first place is much higher than in Serbia. In Serbia, you have something around 160 deaths, and you have close to 8,500 people infected, so not that much. But in spite of that, we had, for instance, the last 2 weekends, there were 3 or 4 days of total lockdowns, so no one can go out. This weekend, on May the 1st, will be again another 4-day lockdown, and people are slowly starting to rebel from their balconies, to shout, to make some noise, and this action is called noise against the dictatorship. An important point is that the state of emergency is introduced without the decision of parliament. This is indeed legal. From the legal perspective, this is important. The parliament met today for the first time after 1.5 months and retroactively confirmed the decisions made by government 1.5 months ago. The tragical point of the Serbian political system is that the mainstream opposition is usually attacking the government from the right rather than from the left. So today we had a chance to hear some statements coming from the opposition, and their main point of concern was a legal aspect. And I'm not saying this aspect is not important, but what is here lacking in the public space is the emphasis on the completely is on the destruction of health, of healthcare, of public services that have brought this society to, actually that produced in this society the unusual number of deaths and unusual number of infected people, taking the conditions in this part of the world, in the Balkans in general. So instead of talking that all the side effects of privatizations of healthcare, of lack of investment in public services, including the healthcare, have brought up this society to the edge of existence because the number of medical workers was not enough. The number of the amount of medical equipment and protection equipment was not enough at the beginning. So instead of talking about these things, that we have come to the a time of pandemic without being ready for such pandemic because of the economic and political decisions taken in the last 30 years since the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the opposition is again attacking only one side of the medal. This one side of the medal is anti-democratic, authoritarian condition under which people in Serbia live. But the other side of the medal is a social and economic aspect of it, and I think that so the tragedy of this condition is that we are now witnessing a complete absence of such substantial critique coming from the mainstream. Instead, there are only some marginal or semi-marginal activist groups who are trying to make this point, talking about labor rights, for instance, in the time of pandemic, or talking about medical workers who are suffering from their poor working conditions. There is a party in Serbia that is marginal nowadays that is called Social Democratic Union, and I'm the member of this party that is trying to build up a more solid and more serious political organization that hopefully in the future will be able to address all these issues, also in the light of what has been going on during the pandemic of coronavirus.
Thanks very much, Filip. I know in the UK we've had last few months spent a lot of time thinking about the opportunities that this crisis has brought to the left, and I think it is really important to be reminded that there's very real dangers that are coming along with it as well, particularly in places where the left does not have such a strong voice. You went on for a bit longer there, so I'm just going to ask you one quick question, if you don't mind. You said that the Serbian population doesn't generally trust the government and therefore is doubtful of medical advice. The question is about what is the general dissemination of information for the people? Like, is there a functioning and trustworthy social media presence at all?
Yes, the media situation is quite tricky because the manner of ruling is absolute. So there are a couple of TV stations that have national coverage, and all of them are under the direct control of the government. There is one TV channel called N1 on which is a cable channel, on which you can learn about some alternative visions of reality in this country. But these media channels are under a constant attack of tabloid press, for instance. They are accused of being foreign agents. There is this peculiarity. I mean, peculiarity of for the regional audience probably is not a peculiarity. For the European, it is, and that is a thing that in this society there is. I mentioned that there is a constant need of finding the enemy. And then whenever you try to make a point, to make a fair point, to criticize the government from the systemic point of view, you're accused, for instance, of being a Soros agent. This is a famous accusation coming from all the governments. Whatever you try to do, especially at the social level, if you're a member of a social movement, if you do some direct actions, you are immediately targeted and labeled as someone who's working for Soros. Social media do work. This action that I mentioned, make noise against the dictatorship that is taking place every evening at 5 minutes after 8, 5 minutes after the applause for the medical workers, actually is spreading across social media and is making some success. I'm afraid this won't be enough. So after the crisis finishes, we'll see whether the opposition is not trustworthy either, and there is a clear crisis of political actor, of a solid subject that can somehow, take all the lack of satisfaction of people and kind of transform it into a solid political program and confront the dictatorship from the left.
Thanks so much, Filip. Thanks for giving us your time this evening. Really appreciate it. For anyone interested, something Filip touched on just then was, earlier when he's talking was about workers, people's working conditions in Serbia during this pandemic. And he's actually written an article on that topic for Rosa Luxemburg. We're going to post that in the chat now. Again, would very much recommend reading. It's very good.
All right. Before we move on to our next speaker, we just want to take this opportunity to plug the World Transform Supporters Network. Since our first call last month, TWT has had 30 new signups, with people on average donating £5 to £10 a month. It might not sound like a lot, but it makes a huge difference. So thanks to all of those who have donated. The coronavirus crisis poses an existential threat to independent grassroots organizations like TWT. And in the time of global crisis and uncertainty, collective political education on the left is more important than ever. But we're running on a shoestring budget. We know that many people are in tough financial situations, especially at the moment, and we'll always ensure that content like this is available free of charge to everyone. However, if you are someone who is secure financially, and if you believe that the work TWT does is important, please consider supporting TWT to help us scale up and sustain the work that we do. You can sign up at theworldtransformed.org/support. And I'll say that again, just in case you want to write it down. That's theworldtransformed, all one word, .org/support. We'll also post a link in the chat so you can follow it there. Thanks so much.
So from Serbia, we're going to move to France and hear from our next speaker, Malena Reali. Malena is actually Argentinian, but lives in Paris, where she's an editor at the progressive media outlet Vent Se Lève, who are a media partner of Novara Media and Jacobin. Malena also has an academic background in political science. France has a very recent example of emergency legislation being maintained far longer than originally intended, with many of the measures brought in after the 2015 terrorist attacks still in force today. Malena, thank you very much for joining us. Could you please tell us a bit about some of the policing measures that have been introduced in France since the start of this crisis and why you might be concerned that these will outlast the virus?
So hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. What I will try to do is to talk a bit about the situation here in France and to explain the precedent that this country has with the state of exception and why it may worry left-wing organizations that these measures will stay in place after the crisis. So currently, France is officially in a state of sanitary emergency. That's a completely new legal regime that provides a framework for containment and for other measures restricting freedoms to fight the pandemic. In practice, what this does is that it allows the executive to rule by ordinances, so to make decisions by decree, even when these may restrict civil liberties. Amongst these measures, probably the most obvious one is the confinement of the population. That is sort of the same thing that has taken place in the rest of Europe. Today in France and until the 11th of May, people are required to stay home. There's a set of exceptions to this rule, so you can go out of your residence if you need to go to work and you cannot work remotely. You can go out to work to buy essential items. But the specificity of France is that to go out, people need to carry a sworn declaration at all times stating why they're outside. And then you can be stopped by the police at any time on the street and be asked for identification and be asked for this sworn declaration. And if you're outside without a declaration or that you cannot prove that you're outside for a valid reason, so one of the reasons stated in this list of exceptions, you can get a fine of 135 euros, which gets higher for reoffenders. And eventually, after 3 repeated offenses, you can be put into police custody. So this poses a whole set of problems regarding legal procedures, regarding the possibility to appeal this decision, and also regarding police brutality and the fact that police forces have arbitrarily been harsher on some populations than others. But a lot of these criticism is not specific to France. I believe that our speaker from the UK may speak about this as well. These issues with judicial guarantees, police violence, and everything are general features of restrictions on freedoms. What is the most interesting about France, so what I can bring to this conversation, is the very recent precedent that we have in this matter. Because in 2015, France was hit by a wave of terrorist attacks that you may remember. And at the time, we also had a state of exceptionality installed. The thing is that this state of exceptionality ended up lasting more than was intended and then eventually being partially transposed into regular law. So what were supposed to be temporary measures to fight the specific problem of terrorism ended up lasting more than intended and then eventually partially became permanent. At the time, the state of emergency that was declared was based on a regime of legal exceptionality that had been created for the Algerian War of Independence, so in 1955. And at that time, to manage the unrest in Algeria, it made sense to create a legal regime that would restrict a number of civil liberties and give more power to the executive branch. So amongst other things, authorities were allowed to prohibit the movement of people in certain areas. They were authorized to place a suspect under the control of an electronic bracelet or even force them to stay within a certain perimeter of their residence without a trial, so without a proper court issuing that decision. It also authorized searches in residences without a warrant from a prosecutor, and it allowed authorities, so executive authorities, to close places of religious worship if they considered that these places were promoting discrimination, hatred, or violence, and that even if a judge hadn't taken that decision, if a judge hadn't confirmed that fact. Initially, when the state of emergency was declared, it was supposed to last 12 days. That's the maximum that the executive can declare a state of emergency in France. But then it was renewed 6 times by parliament. So it was declared in November of 2015, and it ended up lasting until November of 2017. So we had 2 years of temporary measures that ended up becoming long-term. We had 2 years of a state of exceptionality during which the balance of powers was completely thrown off, and during which basic guarantees, basic checks and balances weren't being respected. And unsurprisingly at that time, these measures weren't only applied to the fight against terrorism. Authorities were allowed also to ban reunions if they considered them likely to cause disturbances, and that caused many ecologist demonstrations to be cancelled. Climate marches were cancelled, and ecologist protesters were forced to stay near the residences. So you can see how these measures were taken out of their initial context. And to add insult to injury, after those 2 years, some aspects of the state of emergency were transposed into regular law. So all of the things that I quoted before, the authorities being allowed to prohibit movement, them being authorized to place a suspect under control of the police, closing places of religious worship, all of those were then transposed into regular law. So they weren't anymore the measures that were taken for an emergency. They were just regular parts of French law. So this goes to show the danger of keeping these measures in place. And it should definitely make left-wing movements, but anyone who's concerned about civil liberties, very observant of the current situation, very cautious that it doesn't transcend the context of the pandemic. And we should be on the lookout that these measures don't become permanent. Then if we start thinking about how the left is currently responding and how it should respond to this situation, at least in France, we see that left-wing parties haven't had a unified response to the crisis and to these measures. Jean-Luc Mélenchon's France Insoumise has been vocal and critical of the government, but the Green Party has been mostly silent, and the Socialist Party has also been mostly invisible. So the first thing I would say is that it would be beneficial to the left to have some sort of unified response with a common strategic goal against what they perceive to be as malfunctions of the government's response. The second thing, I believe, would be that the left should have a strategy of responsibility, because this is a time where the government is perceived as being completely irresponsible. So it's an opening for the left to pose themselves as the most responsible option, to make people see them as having more responsibility than even the ruling party in France. This is something with which the left in France has had issues in the past. If you look at the far left specifically, if you look at the France Insoumise, you can see that in 2017, they had a near perfect presidential campaign. They won a bit over 19% of all votes, which is huge for a party that was completely out of the regular establishment parties. They profited actually from the near collapse of establishment parties in France. So this presidential campaign was a huge success. But then when you look at the scores they had in the 2019 European elections, it's a whole other picture. They had a bit over 6% of voters behind them. And I think this responds to the fact that people need certainties. People need to vote for parties that assure them of a predictable future, that assure them of a safe future. They need to vote for options that they see as reliable, that they see as dependable and competent. That was already true in 2019 because of all of the problems that were going around in the world at that time, but it's especially true now with the coronavirus pandemic, that people need to vote for parties that are reliable, that they can trust in. So to sum up, left-wing parties and movements in France and in Europe should monitor that these restrictions on civil liberties are proportionate, just, and especially temporary. But although it's critical that we keep an eye on these facts, we shouldn't go against the general consensus. We shouldn't go against the common sense and dismiss the necessity of these measures altogether. What we should do, on the other hand, is have a viable long-term strategy and position ourselves as not only a critical opposition, not only a polemicist, not only a controversial parties, but also a viable and safe alternative for the future.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Malena. There's yeah, I mean, I'm not sure people were really aware of the sort of extent to which the government had been able to extend and maintain certain powers well beyond the period of crisis. So it's quite shocking to hear about that. We'd like to ask you a little bit actually about how the crisis is interacting with kind of union struggles that are going on at the moment in France. So have the police powers that have been brought in to suppress or that have been brought in under the crisis, have they been used to interfere with union or wildcat worker actions that are going on at the moment to secure safe working conditions or pay increases for workers? And in addition to that, has there been any response from the Yellow Vest movement, something we've heard quite a lot about here in the UK?
So about the, let me think. About these measures being taken to suppress what unions have been doing, that hasn't really been the case. Unions have been very visible lately because this whole pandemic happened at a time where the government was trying to pass new legislation on pensions. That was hugely unpopular, especially with unions. But these measures have these police measures have mostly been confined to enforcing confinement, to enforcing the lockdown. So they haven't really had an impact on unions. But unions have vocally expressed concern over the fact that the government has tried to pass some laws for the flexibilization of working conditions and of labor contracts. With the excuse that because of the economic crisis that is coming, because of the lockdown and because of the coronavirus, companies need to make savings, and companies need to and everyone needs to kind of work together to ensure that the economic impact isn't too strong. Interestingly enough, obviously, when they say that everyone needs to work together, they expect the working class to bear the weight of this crisis. About the Yellow Vest movement, the Yellow Vest movement was already losing impulse when this happened. It was mostly active last year. Obviously, all of the people who were part of it are still in the opposition to the government. But it isn't something that was as present in the French political sphere at the time this began happening. What we can see from the Yellow Vest movement is that during the Yellow Vest protests, police brutality became more prevalent. It became more severe. There were over 3,000 victims, so 3,000 people hurt during the protests. And this is something that has probably been continued now. So this escalation of police violence is still in place now. When you see what is happening in poor suburban neighborhoods with mostly people of color, you see how police are enforcing completely arbitrary rules there, and they're being way more harsh than they are in rich neighborhoods.
Thank you so much for that, Malena. It's really, it's really interesting to see how it's affecting people differently in France to here. So now we're going to move to Poland to speak to Marcin Antosiewicz, who is a journalist and a political scientist. Marcin has worked as a political correspondent for over 15 years across the world, but mostly in Europe. The situation in Poland is different to some of the countries we've discussed so far. And the concern is not as much with the government expanding power through legislation, but rather that they are taking advantage of a bump in the polls to force through an early election at a time when it is basically impossible for the opposition to campaign. So, Marcin, would you be able to just briefly describe the conditions of the lockdown in Poland, but then, elaborate on the circumstances around this upcoming election?
Yeah, hello, good evening, Emma, good evening, Patrick. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for that call, and good evening, everyone. I have an impression that the coronavirus has arrived to Poland around 5 years ago, as the ruling party, which we have right now, came on power, because we have this authoritarian virus for almost 5 years. But to the restriction, as you said, the situation in Poland is very specific because of the presidential elections, which they were planned to take place on May 10, but because of the coronavirus, because of the situation, it's very difficult right now to hold these elections. But the government ignored these dangers, and they do everything what is possible to hold these elections. To the restrictions, because you have asked about it, the restrictions are quite similar to the most West European countries. People here in Poland can leave home just to go to work, buy food or medicines. Restaurants, shopping centers are closed for almost 1 month. People can go out as well for exercises, for jogging, and this kind of activities. But of course, we must keep physical distance each other, which it sounds very okay, but it's, of course, as the colleague from Greece said, this is as well could be a huge problem for the protests, for example, and the key question about these restrictions, because when you have a look at these restrictions, they are quite okay. And one more, I forget it, we need to wear face masks for almost 10 days. So this is one more restrictions after Easter. And they, when you have a look at them, they look okay. But this is the question about trust, that for almost 5 years, the country is very divided. The current government is laying all the time in the public media. They took control over the public media around 5 years ago. So everything what you can hear and see on the public radio and television, there is really just the government propaganda, nothing else. So all critical questions which we have as a journalist, there are no answer for that. At the beginning of the crisis, the government and the people from the ruling party, the politicians from the ruling party, they ignored the virus. For example, the health minister, the health secretary said at the beginning, actually there is no need and there is no sense to wear the face mask. But now we have these restrictions without any extra explanation. Because at the beginning, that was the statement of him was at the beginning of February. Now we are in the middle of April, and the government says, okay, now we have to wear this face mask. And now at the moment, we have over 12,000 corona cases in the country. So there is more corona cases in the country, and the government says right now that, okay, now it's time to wear face masks. But 2 months ago, the health secretary said there's no sense to wear any. And there was a lot of examples at the beginning of the crisis that they really ignore the situation. Then they realized the situation is quite serious, so we need to act, we need to do something, but that was very late. And as I said, this is very difficult for journalists to control them, to ask critical questions, because they don't answer. For example, if you as a journalist send the list with questions to the ministry or to the ruling party, they, for example, I'm from the quite opposition magazine, so they don't answer on my questions. So this is very difficult to take control on the public institutions. And the crucial question is trust, as Filip from Serbia said. This is the problem in Poland, that we are very divided, and in these difficult times, I think this is a time to come together. to build trust. This is crucial for the democracy. In the democracy, we can have different opinions, we can be from different parties, we can write from different magazines, but we should have a common ground when we can understand each other. But this is not the case in Poland anymore for almost 5 years. And in this particular situation, when we have elections in 12 days, May 10, there is presidential elections, and the opposition parties, opposition leaders asking to do not hold these elections, because this is very dangerous for the people. But the government is giving an expression to the public: the situation is not so bad, we can hold these elections, don't worry about that. They trying to change the law because they see the regular way of voting, it's not possible anymore. So they want to change the law and to have postal voting, which we didn't have in the country, never. So we don't have any experience with postal voting. And have a look, right now this law is debating in our upper chamber, which calls Senate, and Senate is going to vote on that law May 6th. And the elections should take place on May 10. And so the law from the Senate, from upper chamber, will go to under chamber, where peace has a majority, in the evening on 6th of May. And they will vote for it, probably, because now this is a very shaky majority of peace. This is another problem. So we have a health problem, we have a political problem, we have a constitutional problem. But okay, let's make a scenario that they will vote for it. They have majority, so that it will take that will be on in the evening or in the night of 6th May, and then in 3 days we should vote. So this is a very crazy scenario, but this is what the ruling party is trying to do here. And as you said, there's no conditions for the opposition's leader to make any election campaign. There is people stay at home, so there is no possible to make any election rally, election meetings. And as I said, the government took control on public media at the beginning of the government, and that was January 2016. So really, the public media, state media, they're showing just the current president, which is a candidate of Law and Justice Party, of ruling party, and they blame the opposition every day. They say they are traitors, they cooperate with the Germans, with the European Union, they're not patriots. This is a very difficult situation for the opposition. We have, of course, independent media still. This is not, Poland is not Hungary, not yet. We have independent media, but this is just like the country is very divided, so we can just have a contact and interactions with half of population. The another half of population listen to public radio and watch the public television, and you have a lot of lies every day there. So there's a very difficult situation. And one more point, by the Polish law, by the Polish constitution, we have 3 types of state of exceptions. One of them is martial law, which is not the case right now. The second one called state of natural disaster, and it's actually for the situation like pandemic. So that should be the law for this kind of a crisis. And the second one, it's state of emergency. And the state of emergency is very dangerous because by the law of the state of emergency, the government can ban the opposition party, can close media outlets, and can suspend the parliament. So the opposition is asking the government and the parliamentary majority to announce the state of natural disaster, because if the government and the president, the executive, will announce this state of natural disaster, the presidential elections will be automatically replaced for the end of August or for the beginning of September, when we hope that the situation will be much better, and that the voting won't be so dangerous. But this is something what the government doesn't want you to do, because, as I said, they're saying it's not so bad. So you can vote, you can vote by the post, and because they see that in the polls, their candidate, the current president, have right now doing very well, have almost or over 50%. So this is the way of the ruling party here in Poland to consider the power for the future. And if they will win the presidential election, the country will be more divided, and that will be a very, very huge problem for the independent media and for the independent of judiciary, because in the last years we had a lot of attacks on independence of independent judges, of independent courts, and of independent media. So this is what we expect if they will hold these elections in a few days, and if their candidate is going to win, the situation will be very, very bad for the media and for the judiciary.
Great. Thank you, Marcin. It's really, really important to be aware that there are many different ways that governments are taking advantage of this crisis, and particularly that while they might be doing things that on the surface seem to be legitimate, such as running elections, that can often still serve to undermine democracy. We are running slightly over time, so I just want to ask really quickly. I know that, again, something that we've heard quite a lot about here, that the government in Poland are using coronavirus to push through awful anti-abortion laws. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the resistance to those laws, and particularly the resistance that the left party are putting up.
Yeah, actually, you know, this situation, first of all, I need to say that what the government is trying to do since years, and this ruling party, they really, they don't want to give women this safety, this security that the state stands of their side. They always talking about this abortion issue, but the truth is as well, and this is important to understand, and they just dealing with this topic, but actually they do nothing. So they just talking about it for years, because they know that there is no majority to change the law. And the law right now is one of the restricts abortion law in Europe. It calls in Poland abortion compromise, and this compromise, this is the law from 1993. So this is like 27 years old, and maybe at that time that was a compromise, but right now there is no a compromise, because the abortion in Poland is banned except in 3 circumstances. This is important to understand. One of them is when the woman's life or health is endangered by the continuation of pregnancy. The second exception is when the pregnancy is a result of a criminal act of rape. This is the second exception. And the third exception, and that was the law from past week, the proposal, the abortion right now is allowed when there is a high probability of a severe or irreversible fetal impairment. And PiS, the ruling party, called this exception as eugenika, as the Nazis called this kind of abortion. But they talking about since years, as I said, and the situation from last week, it wasn't so dangerous, I would say, because that was a proposal, a citizenship proposal. We have this kind of instrument, let's say, that when a group of 100,000 citizens sign an act and proposal, that the parliament has 6 months to debate on it and to decide if they send that to the committee or to reject that. So there was really the last time to debate on that citizens' proposal. So it wasn't really connected to the coronavirus situation. That was just something what was, and it wasn't a proposal of the ruling party. That was a proposal of one woman, which is connected to Ordo Iuris. I don't know if you know this organization. This is quite ultra-Catholic organization, originally from Brazil. And they have a very strong office here in Poland. and a lot of lawyers, and that was a proposal of this organization, which was supported, as I said, by 100,000 people. So that was the reason that the parliament should talk about it. And at that moment, because that was really, that was in the age with this 6-month time to debate on a citizenship proposal.
Thank you, Marcin. That was really useful. Thank you. We're going to move on quickly now, but before we go to our final speaker, I want to talk just briefly about a new tool that has been developed for the left. Probably most of you know, during the general election, Momentum launched mycampaignmap.com, which is a digital tool which allowed you to see which constituencies needed your help the most. Now Momentum have repurposed the map for the fight against coronavirus. So you can head to volunteercoronavirus.com, type in your postcode, and you'll be able to find and join Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups with other people that are supporting each other in your area. And we've also just added a live stream feature, so that will be updated with all of the live streams, such as this one and the other left organizations running over the next few weeks. So yeah, check that out at volunteercoronavirus.com.
Finally, we're going to return to the UK to hear from our last speaker, Gracie May Bradley. Gracie works for the human rights organisation Liberty as their policy and campaigns manager, and she's also been leading on their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Gracie has written really recently for The Guardian on how measures introduced in the UK will inevitably impact migrants and people of colour more severely, and we'll post a link to the article in the chat. Gracie, thank you so much for joining us. We know that the coronavirus bill passed in the UK contained a far broader range of measures than were perhaps reported on in the mainstream press. Would you mind giving us a bit more detail about the bill itself, and also touch upon what a less coercive response might have looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the coronavirus bill is something that we at Liberty were trying to kick up a huge stink about, but it didn't really penetrate the news cycle before it was too late. The Act does some good things. So, for example, the Act allows retired NHS workers to come back to work, for example. It also contains, some of the most draconian restrictions on our civil liberties in at least a generation. So there are extensive detention powers for police and immigration officers. So you can be detained by the police for up to 48 hours if you're believed to be potentially infectious. And the way potentially infectious is defined essentially encompasses any one of us. The Act also allows for forcible coronavirus testing on pain of criminal sanction if you say no. It means that a person can be compelled to answer questions if kind of interrogated by a public health official. You can also be ordered to self-isolate in any location with no upper time limit, with no involvement of a judge, and you would commit a criminal offence if you fail to do that. The Act also contains powers to restrict gatherings, premises, events, and unlike the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, it contains no exemption for strike action, for example. There's also no protection for protests. The Coronavirus Act allows the government to close the borders unilaterally if there aren't enough border force staff. It allows for the postponement of elections. It weakens safeguards on detention under the Mental Health Act. It weakens social care provision. And it also makes changes to the regime governing covert surveillance powers. So those powers that were revealed by the Snowden revelations, it essentially weakens some of the safeguards surrounding those powers. And those safeguards were already inadequate. And I think a really important thing to say is that there's actually no hard upper time limit on how long these powers can remain in force for. So yes, all of the headlines spoke about 2 years. In theory, yes, the powers last for 2 years, and they are, in theory, reviewed every 6 months by the House of Commons. But essentially, the House of Commons either has to say yes to all of them continuing or no to any of them continuing. So if we're still in a position where we need to allow retired NHS workers to come back to work, but we do not need a power to unilaterally close the border, the House of Commons either has to say yes to all of it or no to all of it. So it's not really a particularly effective safeguard. And crucially, the Act also includes clauses that would allow for the powers that it contains to be extended beyond that 2-year period on a rolling basis if Parliament says yes. So it's a really draconian set of restrictions on our civil liberties. And I would say that, yes, this had the benefit of some parliamentary scrutiny. It was nodded through by the opposition, which meant that essentially they agreed not to try and make lots of amendments and not to hold up its progress. And I think that that's actually really concerning. But we then have separate regulations that I'll call the lockdown regulations that were made under the Public Health Act 1984. And these are the regulations that say you can't leave the house or be outside without a reasonable excuse. And you can have you'll end up with a fixed penalty notice or a criminal offence potentially if you do breach those regulations. So we've got the Coronavirus Act, we've got these Public Health Act regulations, and then you've got the guidance for the regulations. And that's where we've seen the police enforcing against guidance that is not law. So, when Michael Gove stood up and said, oh, you can only exercise for 30 minutes a day. Well, that's not true. That's not what the law says. But of course, the police ended up enforcing against, what government was saying. So government by decree, which Malena talked about, and not actually against what was in the regulations. So I know somebody asked me to chat about the Civil Contingencies Act. And yeah, one of the things that Liberty said is that some of these powers could have been introduced under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. As I've said, that contains protection for things like strike action, but crucially, powers under that act have to be reviewed after 30 days. And indeed, they have to be voted on by Parliament within 7 days. So we've got the 6-month review on the Coronavirus Act. And I should have said that with the lockdown regulations, in theory, they're meant to be voted on by Parliament after 28 days. But government chose to introduce them just as Parliament was going on recess. And there's so much recess between now and June that Parliament won't even get to vote on these lockdown regulations until June. So that's essentially 2.5 months of a police state and Parliament having no say. In terms of how the left should respond or, thinking about less coercive measures, I think it's really important not to assume that any exercise of state power is necessary. It's fine to conclude that an exercise of state power was necessary and proportionate, but we shouldn't start from a position of trust necessarily. That's not necessarily going to serve us very well. And I think that it is important to ask those questions around if the government had acted earlier, if they had tested, traced, isolated, if they'd properly protected health workers, if they had properly educated the public rather than simply saying, everybody wash your hands, there's a real question as to whether or not a lockdown that was backed by coercive police powers and criminalisation would actually have been necessary. There was a coalition of lawyers and public health experts in the States who wrote a letter, and they said voluntary self-isolation measures are more likely to induce cooperation and protect public trust than coercive measures, and they're also more likely to prevent attempts to avoid contact with the healthcare system. So I think, yes, it was important for the left to kind of say, or for people to kind of say, physical distancing is really important, but it was potentially a bit naive to assume that a state that had been carceral and had strategically left lots of people out up until this pandemic would become a caring state in the context of a pandemic. It was very unlikely that that was going to happen. And so in calling for physical distancing, what we needed to do and what we need to continue to do is talk about all of those people who have been left out by the state for years and years and years. And And that means, you know, disabled people, homeless people, gig economy workers, migrants, people of color, sex workers, renters, people in places of detention, victims of domestic abuse. All of these people are disproportionately affected by this pandemic. It's not a great leveler, it's magnifying existing patterns of discrimination and power imbalances in society. And I think, you know, it should be absolutely no surprise that the first person convicted under the Coronavirus Act was a Black woman, and she was wrongly convicted. But when you look at what happened when the police were given essentially free rein to stop and search young Black men, we saw massive disproportionality. It shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone that that's what happened when police were handed massive powers, because they tend to overreach. The other thing I think it's really important for the left to do, and which I think, you know, Liberty works with people of all political persuasions. And I think we've been trying very hard to get the left to think and talk about surveillance and its impact on civil liberties. And that can sometimes feel like a bit of an uphill battle. You know, there's a contact tracing app that's being developed. The government has chosen not to go with a decentralized system, and that means that's essentially worse for our privacy than other options that are on the table. But I'm also really worried about this NHS dashboard that essentially lots of different private companies have become involved in developing. So we're seeing that companies like Palantir, which is a security tech company that's been massively involved in the development of racist predictive policing tools, it's fueling Trump's deportation regime in the US. It's complicit in gross human rights violations, and that company is now gaining a foothold in our NHS. And it's not difficult to see that that will cause problems not just for marginalized people, but for all of us in general. So I think there needs to be real scrutiny of the involvement of private companies in the government's coronavirus response. But I suppose I wanted to end on kind of a lighter note, which is to say that in terms of what the left should be demanding as this crisis continues and when it's over, I mean, the seeds are already there. Amazing work has been done by grassroots groups for a long time and continues in the context of this crisis. I mean, you've got IWGB and the United Voices of the World fighting for the rights of gig economy workers. You've got Stopwatch and the monitoring group organising to let people know what our rights are in the policing context and how to intervene when we think people's rights aren't being respected. You've got Bail for Immigration Detainees and Freed Voices campaigning to free people from immigration detention. You've got ACORN and the London's Renters Union doing amazing work on renters' rights. And Liberties working really closely with the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants to kind of demand an end to the hostile environment in the context of the pandemic and beyond. So I suppose there's a lot to be really, really worried about, but this is also a moment in which things that government said wasn't possible, wouldn't ever be possible, are actually now being implemented at the stroke of a minister's pen. So, I mean, really, it will be what we make of it.
Yeah. Thanks, Gracie. That was, yeah, I mean, that was incredibly comprehensive. We actually had a series of questions for you and things that we were quite keen for you to touch on, but you covered most of those. And yeah, it's really sort of scary to hear about the lumping together of different measures in the same act that makes certain things that are perhaps less necessary then very difficult to get rid of later down the line without removing all of the legislation that's been introduced. So yeah, thanks again for joining us. I will post a link to the article that you wrote in the chat.
And that brings us, thank you, Gracie, that was really good. That brings us to the end of the call. We're going to post all of these links in the chat box. But that will disappear soon when the call ends. So please copy and paste them to somewhere safe. Finally, just once more, if you are able to, please consider joining the World Transformed Supporters Network. Political education on the left is more important than ever, and the crisis poses a real risk to small organisations like TWT. Go to theworldtransformed.org/support. That's theworldtransformed.org/support.
Thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight, and a huge thanks to all of our speakers for giving up their time, but also thanks to everybody who's listening. It's really heartening to know that so many people are staying engaged during such a crucial moment in our political history. Please remember to stay safe and to take care of yourselves and one another. And while many of our speakers tonight have scrutinised the measures that have been introduced during the crisis, we in no way refute the need for physical distancing. Keeping people safe has to be our priority.
In next week's call, we will be looking at the devastating impact of the present crisis on the arts and culture sector and how we can ensure that egalitarian and liberatory art can flourish in the future. As well as a great lineup of speakers, we'll be expanding the limits of what's possible on a Zoom call. So keep your eyes peeled for announcements about this in the coming days.
I just want to do a final shout out to the TWT Supporter Network. The link is being posted in the chat. So if you are in a position to donate and support the incredible work that they do, then please do that. I also want to do a shout out for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and all of the incredible work that they do. There's lots of amazing analysis and research on their website, which is all available for free. We'll post a link to that in the chat as well, but please do take a look. They're doing lots of incredible work, and importantly, it's global, and it's really important that we learn from the struggles occurring in other countries at this time. That's it.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for all the speakers, and we'll see you next week.
See you soon. Cue the music.
Dame i gospodo, drugarice i drugovi, dobrodošli u Dubioza kolektiv Karantin Show, i to naš treći dio. Sa nama je ponovo naša oficijalna prevoditeljica, gospođa Googleta Translatović. Dajte, molim vas, jedan ogromni virtualni aplauz za gospođu Googletu.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Googleta, and tonight I'm tasked with translating all the nonsense these Balkan guys are saying, and I think that their music is shit.
Googleta, hvala na lijepim riječima, a večeras samo za vas sviramo najbolje balade Dubioza kolektiva i to u akustičnoj verziji, a imat ćemo i neke specijalne goste.
Tonight, just for you, we play our best ballads in acoustic version, and we will have special guests.
Prvo večerašnje uključenje imamo iz Konjica. Tamo nas čeka naš jedan i jedini Fadil Buturović. On je harmonikaš koji jednako dobro svira i crne i bijele tipke.
The first guest is from Konjic. One and only, Fadil Buturovic is waiting for us there. An accordion player who plays both black and white keys equally well.
Čujemo se, Fadile?
Čujemo se.
Jesi spreman?
Spreman.
Ajmo, Fađa!
Aerodrom je sletilo više čarter aviona, sastaju se predsjednici našeg regiona. Sastanak je hitan, a tema je korona. Svi žure da gliserima stignu do Briona. Današnja je tema samo izolacija. Hoće li biti love od Ujedinjenih nacija? Da li dići porez da se spasi ekonomija? Teške teme pa je neizbježna gastronomija.
Kod švedskog stola su Vučić i Milanović. Polako se pridruže Bakir Izetbegović. Od današnjih sastanka zabolile ih nogice. Zašto švedskom stolu fale švedske stolice? Vučić kaže:
naše težnje i aspiracije su kako profitirati od ove situacije. Milanović kaže:
a čuj, kompa, kužiš koliko ti je kreve dok ti toliko se i pružiš.
A baki mi na to samo jednu stvar da doda, samo neke zdravlja, bit će sve ako Bog da. Inšala, ako Bog da.
A Željko Komšić puninu mira dobio je šita od zvaničnog Alžira. U oblaku dima dok uzima gitaru, kaže hajde pa da zapjevamo onu našu staru.
Pandemija je kurva, ubila je bomba. Sada svi smo isti. karantinsko doba.
A sve tri delegacije stoje na balkonu u dobroj atmosferi, šta ih briga za koronu. Da li je od rakije ili dobrog šita, svima se učinilo da čuju druga Tita.
Da vam kažem, drugovi, majku li vam pašu, to je zadnja kap što prelila je čašu. Dok se narod pati i ćete tajno, siđete na goli otok u karantin trajno.
A nije ni zbog droge i nije kriva loza, sada opet čuju glas Josipa Broza.
A zakaj ste se usrali, samo malo humora, da vas malo otrgnem od sastanka i umora. Zasviraj harmoniku, razvežimo kravate, za narod ćemo lako, kojim jebema. Pandemija je kurva, ubila je bomba. Sada svi smo isti, u karantinsko doba. Pandemija je kurva, ubila je bomba. Sada svi smo isti, u karantinsko doba.